Confined space entry general requirements. Risk assessment. Prior to any entry being permitted to a confined space, a risk assessment will be conducted by persons who are trained and competent in conducting risk assessments. The risk assessment will determine the level of risk associated with the work that is being undertaken within the confined space, taking into account the hazards identified. In some circumstances, similar work may be performed in confined spaces that pose identical or similar risks. For example, inspection and cleaning of tanks that have all contained the same product and are of a similar dimension. In these cases, a common task risk assessment may be used for the purposes of meeting the requirements of this section. Any common task risk assessment will identify any differences between the confined spaces and any variation to the work method that is being performed. Common task risk assessments may also be used when the same or similar work is being performed within a confined space on a regular basis. When using a common task risk assessment in this manner, the following factors will be taken into account. Any modifications that have been made to the confined space or its associated plant and equipment. Any change in the operating conditions or product contained within that confined space. Any change in the atmosphere or working environment within or in the vicinity of the confined space, and any change in the work method. The risk assessment is to be conducted by a competent persons and is to be reviewed following the opening and subsequent inspection of the confined space to ascertain whether all hazards and risks have been identified and assessed. Risk assessments will be conducted for all work that involves entry into a confined space. Such assessments will be documented and be included in the WMS and will address the relevant hazards associated with the scope of work. Work method statement. The subcontractor will provide a WMS, inclusive of emergency response details which include equipment and lifting or attachment points for rescue purposes. Emergency details will be discussed with the emergency response coordinator prior to initial entry. The WMS will also address the safety controls to be implemented for all equipment used within the confined space, including but not limited to gas cutting equipment, compressed air, welding, grinding, abrasive, hydroblasting and painting. The WMS must be made available to each employee entering the space and discussed as part of the start of shift pre-task meeting. Job safety analysis. Prior to the commencement of any work inside a confined space, all the hazards associated with both the confined space and the work to be performed will be identified. A JSA addressing the task-specific hazards must be undertaken prior to any CSE. The JSA must be made available to each employee entering the space and discussed as part of the start of shift pre-task meeting. The entry supervisor will include in and attached to the JSA a specific checklist which is to be completed prior to initial entry. Confined space permit. A confined space permit is required for all work that will be performed within a work environment that falls under the definition of a confined space and/or additional safety precautions of the project. Prior to the start of a CSE covered under the confined space permit, the permit will be approved by the designated permit authority and the responsible task supervisor, who is supervising the confined space activity. Medical assessment, fitness of entry personnel. They will ensure that their personnel who may be considered for CSE work have had their physical condition and fitness assessed as part of the pre-employment medical assessment for general medical conditions, complaints that is heart conditions, asthma, lung conditions which create shortness of breath, claustrophobia, obesity, etc. Previous medical conditions that may be exacerbated by working in a confined space, that is back injury. No person assessed with the above condition will be permitted to enter confined space. Safe access. Entry and exit to the confined space will be by one designated access opening and controlled by one entry attendant. Where there is more than one access way, entry to the confined space such as manholes flanges, they will be secured with suitable barricades and danger do not enter signage. Additional signage may be required to be displayed by the subcontractor indicating the potential of a particular hazard inside the confined space. Access ways will permit rescue of all personnel who enter the confined space and together with the surrounding area will be kept clear of any obstructions. It may be necessary to provide stairs or ladders to the access levels to gain safe convenient access for work and provide scaffold platforms externally and internally for rescue purposes. The used platforms may be required for safe access and egress and must be included in the risk assessment. Signage. If permanent danger authorized personnel only signs are not posted, the entry supervisor will ensure that an appropriate danger sign has been located near all entrances into a confined space prior to, and during, personnel entry, and throughout confined space operations while normally closed entrances are open. Atmospheric testing. All confined spaces must be thoroughly ventilated prior to entry. Confined spaces that have contained toxic substances or inert gases will be mechanically ventilated and gas tested prior to entry. The CSE issuing authority will define on the CSE permit any atmospheric testing requirements. A trained and authorized gas tester will perform an atmospheric test prior to entry, after each break, after lunch and at the commencement of each shift. The results will be recorded in the CSE permit. Atmospheric testing and monitoring equipment will be provided by the subcontractor to cover their scope of work and comply with relevant national statutory regulations and standards. The CSE issuing authority will identify the necessity of continuous atmospheric monitoring or the frequency of ongoing atmospheric tests if the nature of the confined space or the work being performed indicates this is warranted. Atmospheric tests results will be recorded by the authorized gas tester on the atmospheric testing sheet and attached to the CSE permit. All atmospheric monitoring will be recorded on their atmospheric monitoring testing log, Appendix 2. Where necessary, the confined space will be cleared of contaminants by use of a suitable purging agent. The purging agent or any gas used for ventilation purposes will never be pure oxygen or gas mixtures with oxygen content greater than 21%. As an absolute minimum, oxygen content and propane percentile will be tested at each atmospheric assessment. Other contaminants potentially present will be tested prior to entry and when any repeat atmospheric tests are required. Prior to entry, the atmosphere of a confined space will meet the following minimum requirements. The concentration is at 0% of lower explosive level, LEL. The oxygen, O2, concentration is between 19.5 and 23.5%. The concentration of any other atmospheric contaminant is less than the exposure standard expressed as a time-weighted average, TWA, and there is no potential for the level of atmospheric contaminant to fall outside the above ranges.